Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vic Amar. I'm the Dean here at the College of Law, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the investiture of Professor Kurt Lash as the Guy Raymond Jones Chair in Law. The investiture is a long-established tradition in academia that's used to acknowledge and honor faculty who, over the course of their careers, have shown exemplary achievement in scholarship, teaching, and public engagement. This is the second investiture here at Illinois for Kurt. Back in 2010, he was invested as the Alumni Distinguished Professor of Law. We are delighted to welcome not only members of the College of Law faculty here today, but also Kurt's family to celebrate with us. His mother, his brother, his sister, and his wife and children are all here to be with him, and that's just wonderful. In addition to celebrating our honorees and their families and friends, an investiture provides a chance to honor donors whose vision and generosity make events like this possible. The Guy Raymond Jones Chair in Law is made possible through a generous estate gift from the late Mildred Van Voorhees Jones on behalf of her father, Guy Raymond Jones, who was a graduate of the class of 1902 here. And we are grateful for the Jones family and Mildred's commitment to the University of Illinois, and they are in our thoughts today. This is the first investiture over which I've presided since I arrived here as dean 3 months ago. And it's quite fitting that Kurt is my first, not just because he and I attended the same law school and work in the same field of constitutional law, and not just because I likely wouldn't be here but for Kurt. It was at a Federalist Society conference that he and I attended in the summer of 2014 in Minneapolis that I first found out from Kurt about the dean search on which Illinois was about to embark, and I began to think seriously about applying. The reason it's particularly fitting for me that Kurt is the first one over whom I preside in an investiture is that I am such a big fan of Kurt Lash as a teacher and scholar and as a person. I've admired his work from afar for a number of years, and I'm breaking confidence, I'm sure, but I remember being asked by folks here at the College of Law 6 or so years ago when they were trying to woo Kurt to come here for me to evaluate his work. And he and I, years ago, talked about the possibility of him joining on to my casebook that I co-author at some point. So I've known of Kurt and his work for many, many years, but it's only been since I went through the dean search process and after my arrival here that I've gotten a chance to see up close what a generous, decent, and caring person he is. I am very proud to call him a colleague and even prouder to call him a friend. He received his undergraduate degree from Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and as I adverted to a moment ago, his JD from Yale. After law school, he clerked for the Honorable Robert R. Beezer of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He then went straight into the academy. He started teaching at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, where he quickly earned tenure and was later named as the James P. Bradley Professor of Constitutional Law and the W. Joseph Ford Fellow. While at Loyola, Kurt chaired the executive committee of the AALS section, both in constitutional law and the AALS section on law and religion. And in 2008, he was the DNL Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine's Law School. He joined us here at Illinois in 2010 as the Distinguished Alumni Professor of Law. And as co-director of the program in Constitutional Theory, History, and Law, Kurt has been instrumental in fostering lively debate and discussion through his biweekly constitutional colloquia and other events. Since arriving here, Kurt has been tapped to serve on many of the most important committees, I think a signal of what his colleagues think of him and his willingness to serve, including the Dean Search Committee, the Strategic Planning Committee, and the Curriculum Committee. In the fall of 2012, he was a visiting professor at the law school up the road at Northwestern. Kurt is a prominent constitutional scholar. His work has been published in some of the top law reviews in the country and has been cited not just by other colleagues hundreds of times in the law professoriate, but also by state and federal appellate courts, including the United States Supreme Court. He has written numerous articles and books about constitutional history. Perhaps in particular you might enjoy his most recent book, The 14th Amendment and the Privileges and Immunities of American Citizenship. In 2013, when Peter Sagal, who works for NPR, you may know him as the host of that game show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, set out to do a PBS series traveling across the country on a Harley to explore the meaning of the Constitution, he met up with Kurt in Chicago to discuss a lot of modern constitutional topics, and he was featured, Kurt was, in 2 of the 4 segments in the series. Kurt's research and writing are, as I suggested a moment ago, highly regarded by his peers. His colleagues praise him as, quote, a rare combination, a scholar with profound legal knowledge and the courage to tackle big questions. One reviewer wrote that, quote, there is no originalist scholar who is as creative in his research. Another echoed that sentiment. Quote, he is among the most creative and productive scholars of his generation, which is why yet another commentator asserted that even those who disagree with his conclusions respect his rigor. Personally, I find 2 aspects of Kurt's work particularly compelling. First, he is doing, as some of the observations I just quoted suggest, so-called originalist work, that is, trying to understand the meanings of constitutional text at the time they were adopted, about the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Most originalists focus on the founding in the 1700s, 100 years or so earlier, but the Constitution that we know today perhaps owes more to those of Abraham Lincoln's generation than to those of James Madison's. So it's great that great scholars like Kurt are training their originalist energies on the 19th century. Second, I want to highlight the creative aspect of Kurt's originalist work on which many people have commented. The idea of creative originalism might strike some as a contradiction in terms. Isn't originalism attractive as a methodology, after all, and why everyone has to make some use of it, precisely because history is more objective than, say, moral philosophy? Perhaps, and certainly the biggest adherents of originalism on the Supreme Court would tout how it binds judges more than other interpretive approaches do. But Kurt's work, whether one agrees with his results or not, is itself a wonderful reminder that history does not interpret itself, and that there are a number of key questions one must confront when one practices originalism, such as whose intent counts, whose understandings count, what sources should we consult to discern intent and meaning, what is the level of generality at which we think the relevant meaning and intent, and what factors, in addition to original meaning, should combine to help judges decide actual cases, and so forth. Kurt's work not only displays sophisticated sensitivity to these and related questions, but he is one of the country's leading thinkers on the ways to best do originalism, in addition to having offered important originalist insights about what the Constitution actually should be understood to mean. His passion and intellectual elegance is as apparent in the classroom as it is in his written work. His students say he is, quote, awesome, and that, quote, the excitement he brings to class demonstrates how much he really cares. One student proclaims him the best professor at the U of I. I have seen him in action, both in formal and informal settings with students, and the way he guides them on their own paths of constitutional understanding and discovery is masterful and even inspirational. I could go on, but I think everyone would rather hear from Kurt, and not just because he literally has one of the easiest voices you will ever have the pleasure to hear. Kurt, it is my privilege today to recognize your many accomplishments and confer on you this extremely well-deserved honor. Would you please stand so that I may present you with the medallion marking your investiture as the Guy Raymond Jones Chair in Law.
Thank you.
It's kind of heavy. Watch your glasses. There we go.
Good grief.
Wonderful. Please join me in congratulating Professor Kurt Lash.
Thank you, Dean Amar. Thank you, Vic. What a pleasure to have you here. What an extraordinary honor for the law school to bring you here out of California. You know, the weather's iffy, but we have more water, okay? So, you know, you'll be okay there. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. I thank everyone for coming to share this moment with me and my family. I have a lot of people that I have to thank, so if you'll bear with me just for a moment. First of all, as Vic spoke, my sincere thanks to Edith Jones for the original gift that established this chair. Additional thanks to Lot Thomas, the estate's current trustee. This particular chair has been held by academics that I deeply admire, and I promise to do my best to at least try to follow in their footsteps. I'd like to thank my students, a number of whom I'm very pleased to see are here today. Thank you all for inspiring me, for challenging me, for reminding me daily why I do have the best job in the world, and for reminding me that, in fact, the color of my belt is supposed to match the color of my shoes. I thank my amazing colleagues here at the University of Illinois for welcoming me into this wonderful community of teachers and scholars. This is a fantastic place to teach and research, and I don't know about any of you, but when you walk the halls and when you see the names on the door, when you see the faces on the pictures, it is simply amazing that I have this job. You might share that feeling, and I'm certainly thankful to be a part of this school and this amazing scholarly community. I am blessed to have several members of my family with me today. My sister Luann Garcia and my brother Michael Lash are here from Albuquerque, New Mexico, as is my amazing mother, Sally Jo Lash. My brother was the first in our family to walk through the doors of a law school, and my sister was the first to make enough money to retire young. I follow in the footsteps of my brother. As for my mom, I cannot say enough. She raised us 3 kids, mainly by herself. She kept us fed and clothed and off to school each day and to the public library every week. She filled us with green chili enchiladas and Irish stew. She got us all into college, and she did all of this on a secretary's salary. And when we were finally out of the way, she went on to nursing school. You are an extraordinary woman, and I'm so very proud that you are my mother, and I'm so very glad that you are here today. My 3 children are also here, although they are not children anymore. My daughter Catherine is visiting from Los Angeles, where she works for Loyola Marymount University. My son Nathaniel graduated from the University of Illinois, currently works in Florida as a data journalist for the Tampa Bay Times. And my son Ben is a junior here at Illinois in the School of Media, and who plays trombone for the Marching Illini. All 3 have easily surpassed their father. Ben plays music better than I ever will. Nat understands computer tech better than I ever will. And Catherine writes better than I ever will and understands Pope Francis better than I ever will. I'm a proud father, and I'm so very thankful that all 3 of you are here. And finally, and mostly, my wife Kelly, both the beauty and the brains of the Lash family. For 30 years, you've filled my life with joy and friendship and faith and love. Every hour of every day, I love you something awful. Ti amo. Thank you, my love. Okay, now I'm done with the important part. Before stepping down and before we get to the food, I would like to say a few words about what I actually do. In particular, I'd like to say a few words about our constitutional history and this year's celebration of the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution, the amendment that forever abolished slavery from the United States. But before I launch into that topic, I want to introduce one more person. There we go. This is Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Perea. An officer in the Union Army during the Civil War, Perea later served in the 38th Congress as New Mexico's territorial representative. A Republican and an early supporter of Abraham Lincoln, Perea was in Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln was shot. Francisco Perea is also my great-great-grandfather. As my students will tell you, I'm very proud of my Irish-Hispanic heritage, and given that my mother is wonderfully Irish, and my last name is suspiciously Eastern European, people are often surprised to learn that I'm half Hispanic. Well, here's the story. Francisco Perea had a daughter, Josefa Perea. She married Jose Gonzalez, and they had 7 children, including my grandfather. When that marriage ended, Josefa married a Yugoslavian immigrant by the name of Johnny Lash. Johnny adopted all 7 children and changed their name from Gonzalez to Lash. One of these children, my grandfather, now renamed Louis Lash, married Josefita Garcia, and their son, my late father, Louis Lash Jr., married the very Irish Sally Jo Lee. That makes me 50% Hispanic, 50% Irish, and by adoption, a member of the Yugoslavian Lashes. I am America. Thank you very much. Now, back to Francisco. As a member of the 38th Congress in 1865, my great-great-grandfather would have witnessed one of the greatest days in American history. 18 days from today, on December 6th, we will celebrate the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment. This will be the first of 3 major constitutional anniversaries that our country will celebrate over the next few years. I'm going to have to take a peek at my slides periodically here. In 2018, we will celebrate the anniversary of the 14th Amendment, and in 2020, there we go, we'll celebrate the anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment. These 3 amendments are collectively known as the Reconstruction Amendments, and that name refers to the period of time in which they were added to the Constitution immediately following the period of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed the rights of national citizenship and the rights of due process and equal protection. And finally, the 15th Amendment guaranteed the freedmen the right to vote. Together, they established a body of rights that individuals carried with them wherever they went throughout the United States, and these 3 amendments were the beginning of truly national American freedom. I'm currently under contract with the Chicago University Press to produce a 2-volume set of books that for the first time will bring together the original historical documents relating to the adoption of these 3 amendments. If all goes well, and so far so good, we will publish these volumes in time for the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment in 2018. It is an enormous task that requires going through hundreds, thousands of documents, and one in which I'm receiving incredible help by an amazing team of law students right here at Illinois College of Law. The project is important because much has been forgotten when it comes to the new birth of freedom that occurred a century and a half ago. Today, we tend to think that slavery was defeated on the great battlefields of the Civil War, from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to Glorieta, New Mexico. Or if not defeated by arms, we think that Abraham Lincoln ended slavery by sheer force of his tremendous personality and will. In fact, neither arms nor a president actually ended slavery. We did. It took a difficult and a dangerous exercise of public deliberation and democratic debate to secure the passage of the 13th Amendment, and democracy is a risky thing. It does not rely on military power or the stroke of a presidential pen. It relies on the power of ideas and faith in the possibility of changed minds. The risk, of course, is that people will not change their minds, or worse, they may choose evil over good. Nowhere is this risk and this danger more clearly illustrated than in the history of the 13th Amendment. Most people know that the final draft of the 13th Amendment ended slavery. What many people do not know is that the first draft of the amendment actually protected slavery. Here's the proposed 13th Amendment Congress initially passed in 1861. You can't read too fast or it seems too complicated in terms of its legalese. Here's a paraphrase of what that amendment is stating. Instead of abolishing slavery, this amendment would have protected slavery. In fact, it would have made slavery an unamendable part of the American Constitution. This is the anti-13th Amendment, the pro-slavery 13th Amendment. And believe it or not, it was ratified by a small number of states, including the state of Illinois. Here's the story behind the Slavery Amendment. The 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln triggered a cascade of seceding southern states. Convinced that Lincoln would oppose the expansion of slavery and ultimately cause the extinction of their peculiar institution, one by one the slave states declared their independence from the Union. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated, 7 states had already seceded. Facing the prospect of either a civil war or the dissolution of the United States, Congress attempted to stop the bleeding and entice the seceding slave states to return to the Union by promising them the constitutional right to maintain chattel slavery forever. Outgoing President James Buchanan signed the proposed amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. Incoming President Abraham Lincoln was so committed to preserving the Union that in his first inaugural address, he declared himself as having no objection to the proposed pro-slavery amendment. As he later said, "If I could save the Union without freeing a slave, I would do so." 1 month after Lincoln's inaugural address, South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. As the fighting continued, slowly but surely, the proposed slavery amendment was forgotten as the war waged on. The terrible war, over the course of the next 3 years, cost thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives, and many in the North came to believe that slavery itself had been responsible. It was slavery that had torn the nation apart, and that saving the Union meant ending slavery. In 1863, like we can get here, there we go. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the rebel states who came within the advancing lines of the Union Army. Unfortunately, the proclamation did nothing for slaves behind enemy lines and had no effect at all on those slaves held in states that had not seceded from the Union, the so-called border states. When the war ended, the freedom temporarily granted by the proclamation would also end. And despite the heroic acts of freedmen on the battlefield, it was possible that these men and their families would once again become slaves. Accordingly, in the early months of 1864, some members of the 38th Congress decided that it was time to end slavery forever. These members proposed a new and very different 13th Amendment, an abolition amendment. According to these Republicans, it was time to embrace the foundational principle of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Slavery violated every one of these principles, and it was to be abolished by constitutional amendment. It was a profound proposition. It also failed. In the early months of 1864, the North was divided between Republicans who supported the war and President Lincoln, and Democrats who wanted to both end the war and Lincoln's presidency. Abolishing slavery became caught up in party politics. In the end, although the Senate passed the proposed amendment, the House voted along strict party lines, and the amendment failed. This was not the end of the story. Congress had voted on the 13th Amendment in the spring of 1864, and that summer people turned their attention to the national election that was to be held later that fall. It was probably the most important election in American history. Republicans renominated Abraham Lincoln, who promised to win the war and end slavery. Democrats nominated Civil War General George McClellan, who promised to end the war and leave slavery alone. The election became a referendum, not only on the war and Lincoln's presidency, but also a referendum on freeing the slaves. There was a very good chance that Lincoln was going to lose this referendum. The war was not going well. The advance of the Union Army had stalled at Petersburg and Atlanta. The country was tired of war and its terrible cost in human life. Lincoln himself presumed that he would lose. And then, out of nowhere, Atlanta fell. Sherman's subsequent march to the sea mirrored the Republicans' march to victory that fall. Lincoln won re-election and prepared for his second inaugural. Meanwhile, Republicans won enough additional seats in Congress to guarantee passage of an amendment if it was brought up during the next session of Congress. According to Frederick Douglass, the election results were a mandate from the people that the Constitution of the United States shall be so changed that slavery can never again exist in any part of the United States. In fact, as 1864 came to a close, it was becoming increasingly clear that not only was the North going to win, it was going to win the war soon. And that was very bad news for the slaves. If the war ended and the Confederacy laid down their arms before the passage of the 13th Amendment, the amendment might never be passed at all. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure that would cease to operate when the war ended. Slaves freed under that proclamation might be forced to return to their former masters. If the war ended, therefore, before the amendment was actually adopted, the country might well move on, leaving slavery an issue to be worked out over years or even decades by the states themselves. Recognizing the need for immediate action, President Lincoln encouraged Congress not to wait for the next session, but to act on the amendment during the final months of 1864. The Republican leadership agreed, and during the so-called lame duck period between the election and the end of the session, Republicans reintroduced the same amendment that had failed earlier that same year. They did so knowing that if every member voted the same way, the amendment would fail again and likely never be reintroduced. On the day of the vote, the House of Representatives was packed. The galleries were crammed with spectators, including reporters, Supreme Court justices, anti-slavery advocates, and a number of African Americans, including the son of Frederick Douglass. No one in the room had the slightest idea whether the amendment would receive the required two-thirds majority vote. The Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, actually believed that the amendment was about 5 votes short of passage. When the time came to record the vote, the clerk of the House called each member by name, and as the final group of members were called, it appeared that the amendment remained 2 votes short of passage. At this point, I'd like to turn to the Congressional Globe. This is the official record of the House and Senate debates from the second session of the 38th Congress. Here on page 531, you'll find the most important words ever written in congressional history. So let's quote this page. During roll call, on Mr. English and Mr. Ganson voting aye, there was considerable applause by members on the Republican side of the House. The Speaker called repeatedly to order and asked that members should set a better example to spectators in the gallery. Mr. Kabelfleisch and other Democratic members remarked that the applause came not from the spectators in the gallery, but from the members on the floor. The Speaker remarked, members will take their seats and observe order. The Speaker then directed the clerk to call his name as a member of the House. The clerk called Schuyler Colfax of Indiana, and Mr. Colfax voted aye. This incident was greeted with renewed applause. The Speaker then remarked, the constitutional majority of 2/3 having voted in the affirmative, the joint resolution is passed. The announcement was received by the House and by the spectators with an outburst of enthusiasm. The members on the Republican side of the House instantly sprang to their feet and, regardless of parliamentary rules, applauded with cheers and clapping of hands. Here's how another reporter in attendance described the scene. The clerk handed a paper with the result to the Speaker, and the Speaker in clear tones declared the result, aye votes 119, nay votes 56, and announced that the joint resolution recommending the amendment had been passed by the constitutional majority of 2/3. A moment of silence succeeded. And then, from the floors and the galleries, burst a simultaneous shout of joy and triumph. Spontaneous, irrepressible, and uncontrollable, the men and women in the galleries had risen by common impulse, and the swinging of hats, the waving of handkerchiefs, and the congratulations exchanged on the floor with grasped hands and warm embraces of deep emotion presented in all its aspects a scene of moral grandeur. That's the scene as recorded by an artist who was there at the time. Lincoln signed the Abolition Amendment and he sent it to the states for ratification. You'll be pleased to know that Illinois was one of the first states to ratify. On December 6th, 1865, the Secretary of State announced that 3/4 of the states had ratified the Abolition Amendment, thus ending forever the evil of American slavery. 2 weeks from today, this country will commemorate this day and this moment of 150 years ago. And on that day, I will return to this picture. And I will think about what it means to me, not only as a citizen of the United States, but as a great-great-grandson of Francisco Perea. You see, as territorial representative, my great-great-grandfather was most likely in that crowd that day. It's even possible that he's right there, one of the figures actually celebrating in the crowd. That makes the moment rather personal to me. But even were he not there, I would join the celebration. Ending the grave evil of slavery took more than force of arms. It took an exercise of democratic will. It was not the stroke of a presidential pen. It was not the decision of 9 unelected justices. It was the act of democratic debate and electoral action. Democracy is dangerous. And the 13th Amendment initially failed. But debate continued. Minds were changed. And the people, we the people, chose freedom. It's a moment worth celebrating. And it's an honor and a joy to have a job that allows me to study this period and gather together the documents that preserve this moment in our nation's history. So, my thanks then to this place. My thanks to the University of Illinois, the College of Law, the Jones family for supporting me in this work. My deepest and sincere thanks to all of you for sharing with me this wonderful day. And lastly, my thanks to my great-great-grandfather, Francisco Perea, for making it possible for all of us to be here today. Thank you very much.